Tonight we won't speak of kingdoms or measure the world in borders. Instead, we'll walk north, where the frost holds its breath and even sound feels borrowed. The road here doesn't begin or end at waits, counting quietly under the snow. Bridges rise from the dark like thoughts testing their weight, each plank remembering the last name that crossed it. The air smells of pine and iron. Somewhere far below, water turns stone into patience. If you listen long enough, you might hear your own footsteps learning to whisper. So lower the lights, let the cold settle in without apology. And if your breathing begins to follow the slow rhythm of frost against wood, that's the tollkeeper opening her book. Somewhere beyond that memory, the wind carries a sound too soft to name part chant, part direction. You follow it through the narrow streets where lamps lean inward, as if eavesdropping on time. A door sighs, not from age, but from recognition. It has heard this story before. The sand underfoot becomes a script, the city's language written one grain at a time. And as you step closer, the silence begins to glow because here, even ruins keep their promises. The road begins at the edge of farms, where smoke rises in neat threads, and roosters have the last word they intend to say tonight. Someone taught the path to count long ago. One stone, then another. A plank, then another. They claim there are 9 bridges before the night grows thick enough to ring like iron, and it is polite to walk them in order, the way you would greet a table from left to right. Wind carries kitchen smells over the first span, and the boards tilt as if to show you the angle of the day that just ended. It is not dangerous, only considerate. The second bridge regards your boots and judges whether they are honest, which in this part of the world simply means dry. By the third, the boards add their own breath, which sounds like a cat deciding whether to stay. The bridges are not dramatic. They are small and sure, like a set of spoons. Counting becomes a habit by the 4th span. You count for the bridges, and the bridges count for you. This is useful for memory, because no one writes anything down out here, unless it is night frost on a rail, and even that prefers poetry to precision. The 5th bridge steals a single thought to keep on the far post, and returns it later when you are not looking. The 6th prefers a traveler to have a story about soup, any soup, even a poor one, since a story about soup assures the bridge that your life has included patience. The 7th performs a little trick where it feels longer than it is, the way some names do when you speak them slowly. The 8th is as brief as a nod. The 9th is the one that understands that your next step will land in a different kind of counting altogether. After the 9th span, the path thins until a hound's nose is the toll house bell. It does not bark, it inhales. It is possible that the hound is older than the road, older than the frost, older even than that specific idea of north. No one says its name where it can hear, which is a sort of compliment. The river here moves under a blanket of dark that does not ripple so much as breathe. A woman with a ledger sits by the ford, and her account book is exactly as heavy as you expect, which is to say the weight of an honest sigh. She is not cruel, she is not kind either. She is precise the way a level is precise. There is a chain you cannot see, or you can almost see, sliding across a post as if the world's first door were opening somewhere far below. If this sounds spooky, that is only because you are awake. If you were nearly asleep, it would merely be tidy. The watchers do not ask questions. They listen for answers that you already brought with you. You might think you brought a cloak and a pouch, and perhaps a small broken thing you have been meaning to mend. You also brought your first nickname, the one you would only admit to in a certain kind of weather, and the name your grandmother used when you refused to come in from the snow, and that other name you spoke into a creek once to see if it would float downstream and turn into an otter. Names are the coin here. You pay with syllables. You spend sound. A formal name is like an iron key. It turns slowly and does not snap. A pet name is copper. It is allowed to clink. A deed name, earned at some moment you claim to have forgotten, is worth exactly the distance between the far bank and your sense of humor. The name you will not give is the one you keep in your mitten for warmth. There's a small, persistent etiquette to this form of commerce. You do not boast. That would throw off the exchange rate. You do not whisper unless the hound is sleeping. The interest on whispers is tricky. When you speak a name, the air around your mouth takes on a temperature as particular as the number stamped on a coin. Slightly warmer for truth, precisely the surrounding chill for a half measure, and a little colder for a name you'd try to spin twice. The ledger records in frost. Lines appear, stand there like reeds, and melt as soon as the hound's ear twitches, which is when the account has been fully heard. Nothing is crossed out, because crossing out would be a kind of shouting. Here, things are allowed to fade at their own pace, the way a footmark sinks into thawing ground. There is a concept everyone understands and no one debates. The ledger of memory is not a judge, it is a librarian. If you confess to losing a glove, it shelves that detail near other mittens and the reasons they went away. If you admit to borrowing a horse that technically belonged to the village, it puts your sentence between other sentences concerning practical transportation. A laugh shared at the post is catalogued beside other laughs. A tear is shelved with other weather. The hound sniffs both the way a baker smells loaves and knows which will sing when tapped. When someone returns, which is allowed more often than you would think, the frost pulls a trace of the previous line back out of the wood and shows it to the ledger. A keeper who nods the way a person nods when a kettle chooses to boil at the right moment. Beyond the ford is a hall that does not hurry. This is a feature, not a flaw. The benches have learned not to creak when wait arrives. They prefer to accept people with the mild surprise of a book receiving a bookmark. Bread is broken with the sort of care you would give to a map, not because bread is delicate, but because maps enjoy respect and bread appreciates being treated like something that knows the way. Salt is set near the elbow, which is an old habit from days when elbows were busier. Cups are warmed first by the hands and only then by the mouth, as if the drink wants to be introduced to the person who will own it for a while. If someone has come from far, they are fed before anything is asked. The fork has priority over the question. Some people bring stories, but stories are best passed around after the second slice when they have cooled to a sensible temperature. In this hall, a remarkable thing happens. Silence is the tablecloth, and it never stains. It is spread across the boards so that speech can be set down and lifted again without leaving a ring. This is where you learn that questions can be short without being small. How long is a complete sentence? So is how far? And who may come again? The answers arrive like snow distinct at the edge, soft by the time they land. Someone draws a map in steam on a lid, and when the steam fades, the advice remains. The way the mind keeps the suggestion of a shape after the shape is gone. No one is in a hurry. Even time, which usually drums its fingers, keeps its hat quiet in its hands here. Now and then a visitor wonders what it is they are doing in a hall beyond a ford, with a dog who tolls and a woman with frost ink, and the answer is always the same and never said, making the world large enough for their own steps. The North has many addresses, but this one is for those who pay with names. There is a kindness in having your names counted. It turns you into a small procession. It is similar to being measured for a coat by someone who intends to make it big enough for your shoulders, but not so big you will trip on the hem. Even the benches measure you in their way, with the exact softness you require and not an ounce more. When it is time to cross back, the undoing takes the same careful shape as the doing. A knot tied on the way in is untied on the way out, counted under the breath, right over left, left over right. The rhythm that keeps fishermen from arguing. A footprint is brushed once forward and once back to even the ground, because the path does not need to advertise. The hound is thanked with a palm shown empty of fear and full of respect, which is a very smooth gesture if done properly, like presenting a loaf to the air before slicing it. The bridge post holds a small promise you hung there earlier, a loop of cord or a circle of straw, and it has seasoned a little in the weather and now looks like it belongs to the post as much as to you. You take it down, not as a trophy, but as a keepsake that remembers who it kept safe. There is an old suggestion made by the hall, and it is phrased like a bedtime hypothesis. If doors do not rattle at night, then quiet must be a key that never leaves a pocket. The people who keep the ledger say that names work best once their whole sleep has been spent. You might use a sturdy travel name on the way out, something that fits well under a hat and does not mind rain, and keep the birth name wrapped for morning when it will be clean and polite. If you test the idea by saying your favorite name into the cup and listening for the echo, you may notice that the echo pronounces it better than you do and is not offended by the correction. The North is full of gentle improvements like that. Walking back over the 9th span, you discover that thoughts step as softly as mice in a pantry. The 8th is again a nod. The 7th seems to have shrunk to match your breath. Counting backwards always makes a road feel modest. The 6th recalls a soup story you did not tell and keeps it for later. The 5th returns the borrowed thought you forgot you were missing. It arrives in the pocket of your sleeve the way a coin appears under a thumb. The 4th takes a crumb of your weariness and pays it to the wind, which has a small purse for that sort of thing. The 3rd reminds your boots that they are still honest. The 2nd thinks about cats. The 1st uses what remains of the kitchen smell to sign its name on the cool air. All the while, the dog's nose remembers you with no fuss at all. There is a rumor that if you bring a good stick, the hound will consider a game. But the rumor was likely started by a traveler who disliked standing still while the ledger frosted over. Besides, sticks have other fates in the North, and being a ball is none of them. A better diversion is to watch the way the river's edge edits itself. I have seen the water in such a place erase a line of boot prints at exactly the speed of a lullaby. No sooner, no later. The river is not a poet, but it has learned enjambment. Someone will ask someday why names and not coins. The answer is very small and therefore confident. The sea takes coins and says thank you in storms, while the road tonight prefers things that return when called. A name is home-trained. It comes when you whistle. It can sit beside you on a bench and keep the salt company. It fetches stories, badly but enthusiastically. And when a name has been paid as toll, the person who owned it goes a little lighter, as if their pockets were properly turned out for once. Most of the time we are heavy with names we do not need. This path gives you permission to hang a few of them on a post until you want them again. Do the watchers keep score? It would be too strong to say that. They keep tempo. There is a difference. Tempo is what lets a meal arrive when you are ready to be grateful rather than before or after. The ledger's frost is the notation of that tempo. It appears in neat measures and melts like a note held just long enough. In the morning, if you happen to be there, you would see the posts clean as new slate. No records remain visible, which would trouble certain personalities, but the locals shrug. If they need proof, they say they can always check their sleep. It is usually in good order. If you are still awake now, you could press a fingertip to your own palm and pretend it is the dog's nose. You could try out a name you have not used in a while, perhaps the one that fits best with mittens, and imagine handing it to the river the way you would hand a ladle to a well-mannered soup. Or you could let those names settle in layers like pages in a closed book that is happy to be shut. The hall that does not hurry will not mind which you choose. It has benches either way. It has silence that cannot stain. It has a kettle that knows when to boil and does so without applause. On the far edge of the fields, smoke turns blue and the first chickens begin to think their morning opinions. If you glance behind you, you will not see 9 bridges. You will see exactly as many as your feet require. That is their trick and their courtesy. By the time the frost lifts, you will have returned to your regular change purse of names and will spend them in the usual small markets of the day, where the price of bread is measured in copper and the price of patience in whatever you have left over. But somewhere between the second and the third span, the toll post keeps a little echo of you, like a ring left warm on a table after the cup is lifted. The chain slides once, iron answering iron satisfied. The gate does not ask a question. It simply listens for the answer you brought and finds that it is enough. And because paths like this prefer an ending that is not an end, let us leave a final key in a quiet pocket. Doors know how to behave when we do not jostle them. Names know how to rest when we place them in order by the bedside. Short ones on the left, long ones on the right, the very oldest on top to keep the others from wandering. The road home prefers steady steps and no stories until morning. We close the night gently, the toll paid, the ledger cool, and the last key warmed in the hand, not turning anything at all, just waiting for the kind of sleep that adds up to the right number. Sailors say the sea sends an invoice that isn't written in ink at all, only in ripples, and that if you turn the page, you will find another page, and then a third, each one the same calm gray. The rumor is not dramatic. It sits on the water like fog, and if you try to swat it, your hand comes back damp and slightly wiser. They call this invoice Rand's Net, though it looks very little like a bill and very much like a habit. And the first line item is always quiet. The morning begins with a coil of rope, a chipped cup of ale that pretends to be warmer than it is, and one finger's weight of gold laid where nobody is looking directly. The steersman touches the ring to the black water as if checking its temperature. There is a hush while everyone decides to believe that the sea is a host first, a judge second, and a stomach last. You might think a stomach would rush ahead, but tides are patient in a way pastry never is. If you're still awake later, you could subscribe for more debates between boats and weather. If not, your pillow will sign up as your representative, and I'll address all future correspondence to it. Out beyond the wharf, the boat remembers to breathe with the tide. It is a good old boat that knows the names of the waves, the way some people know the names of neighbors' cats. There are 9 of Rand's daughters in the sagas, each a wave with a mood that cannot be argued with, and the crew greet them under their breath, careful not to mix kindness with flattery, because waves are vain enough without assistance. Unra is the frothing one, who loves to embroider hems on the rocks and then take them back. Diffa is pitching a wave with a farming interest in throwing seeds of spray. We could go on, and the sea usually does. The point is that names are counted like strokes, so courage does not outrun caution. Old hands talk about how the prow nods to the swells, as if to a hall of elders, and how the planks prefer it when you promise them soup later. It is not a superstition so much as a lunch plan. They say Rand's Net is finer than rain and closes without sound. No one describes the chords because no one sees them. Sailors talk about the moment a boat stops arguing with whatever it was arguing with, as if someone sensible put a hand on the boat's shoulder and reminded it that the water is the stage and not the actor. It is a cousin of that other quiet law, the one that says you lower a ring to the tide until it feels the cold and lets go. Both are really just courtesies. In the same tone that landfolk reserve for discussing postmen or the price of onions, old skippers remark that belief is not proof here, only a habit that keeps time with viewers. The crew practice nods even when they don't have to because sleep likes to find them counting, hitches, bends, splices. A vocabulary designed to keep both rope and throat from slipping. Someone explains the reef knot for the 5th time, but softer, the way you would tuck in a child or a memory. Gold goes by another name on this shore. They call it sea fire because it answers darkness rather than defeating it. A coin is clipped or a bead is pierced and hung where no one can see it show off. A brooch that has been keeping a cloak together for years decides to take a stroll on its own and drops a relative into a box by the mast. The gift is deliberately small because the sea is older than greed and would find extra change a little rude. There are stories of people who tossed in too much and discovered their luck turned not bad, but theatrical, which is worse. Proper payment is a bead that blinks once and remembers nothing more about you than your tone. You try to give the sea the same measure you would give a neighbor when borrowing a ladder, just enough to feel polite, not so much that it looks like an apology. What the sea keeps is rarely what you expect. Sometimes it keeps a robe, and sometimes a chest that was all corners and ambition, and sometimes it keeps a name. Mostly it keeps lessons, which are lighter to carry, at least at first. Loss is tallied quietly, faces turned from the wake, because water doesn't need your attention to do its math. A token from a wreck is wrapped and tucked into a chest with a moment for air, not worn as a conversation starter. The old men say that memory becomes ballast. It steadies more than stone, and you can add a handful when the boat leans too hungry toward a story. There is a way of swearing oaths on the oar that does not make a noise loud enough to wake any god. A crew chooses a mark on the loom of the longship's beam and one on the thwart, and the promise is to watch the weather like a reader, to respect the shoal like a porch step, and to count the heads out loud only once, because the second time makes the sea jealous. Nets have rules the way kitchens have rules. You do not step over them. You do not talk to them as if they will refuse to go, because nets adore refusing to go once encouraged. You mend them the way you would mend a friendship, slowly, in good light, with the knot that lies flat and does not brag. There is also fire on board, but it is sea fire of another sort. A lantern caught in wire so it hums rather than sways. A stove that makes the thin coffee think of braver drinks. Knots mark home ports. Each harbor has its preferred loop, its favorite hitch, and each landfall unites one without ceremony, as if every pier in the world had once been carved by a single patient boy who liked identical corners. The discipline that keeps a net from sulking is the same devotion that learned to row without seeing the shore. It is the long faith of doing a small thing correctly because the tide has promised to notice. When the voyage ends well, as it usually does because the sea enjoys being predictable when no one is looking, there is an after portion. It is not a conclusion, just the careful unthreading of the day. Rope remembers strain the way wood remembers storms. Every knot is opened in reverse order, counted under the breath like a quiet spell you say, to convince the evening to stay put a little longer. The cord is coiled and dried with thanks, which seems silly to people who do not listen to tools, but makes excellent sense to tools that liked being listened to. Found sea fire, those coins that weren't yours, are returned to water or to shrine, because attention buys mischief faster than it buys a new roof. The harbor closes gently. The tide kept, voices low, tribute carried without display. There is always someone on the slip with a pencil and a piece of paper showing the wrong year. He is tallying debts paid by habits, lantern trimmed, net aired, deck washed like a floor that has hosted a polite festival of boots. People ask why Ran wants payment at all, as if the sea were an accountant with a quill made of lightning. The answer is smaller. It has to do with remembering that you visited. The sea doesn't need your bead. It needs your courtesy so that you remain someone who knows how to be a guest. The net is not a purse. It is a register. Every clipped coin is a little present pinned to the attendance sheet. It is a school of etiquette where no one rings a bell for lessons because the bell is everywhere. If you once in your life told the weather you were grateful when it could not hear you, you have already passed the course. There are, as always, micro-customs that make the larger custom cohere like porridge. A ship with freshly tarred seams does not boast. It will be too pleased and try to meet a rock just to show you. A sailor who has taken his turn on night watch leaves the bench warm, not empty, which is a tiny proof against the world's sharpness. A young deckhand is taught to tuck her hair not behind her ear, but under her cap so the wind has nothing to flirt with. The wind's compliments are relentless and never lead anywhere. On the first fair morning after foul weather, a crew scatters crumbs on the water, not to feed gulls, which need no help, but to remind themselves that all fragile things float briefly and beautifully if you let them. And there is the useful superstition that if you say last voyage, the boat will misunderstand and get sentimental. But if you say another voyage, it will take you out and bring you back with humble competence. Boats prefer continuity. So do nerves. The least exciting facts, which are the most soothing, come at night when the wake glows pale with plankton. And even the talkative men agree to be quiet because quiet is a better story than anything they have. Oilskins dry on pegs like well-behaved fish. The compass does nothing dramatic and is therefore a hero. The mast creaks not because it is tired, but because wood likes to stretch exactly this much before it sleeps. A coiled line rests, and even though it is a circle that contains possibility in every direction, tonight is just a circle. Someone writes a letter on their knee and dates it with a confidence that surprises them. The sea has borrowed their doubt for a while to polish it, perhaps, or to put it in a jar with. Tie pull things for the amusement of a small goddess who collects unimportant treasures. Morning after a crossing has a housekeeping list so old it has become weather. Nets are shaken, not scolded. Planks are rinsed the way you would rinse a thought before thinking it again. The ring that touched black water is checked for being ordinary, because extraordinary rings make trouble. Names of those who worked the net are spoken softly, so the net does not feel singled out for praise. Praise makes nets imagine they are art, and then you discover them hanging on a wall and refusing to fish. Tomorrow's rope is laid out straight, so dawn will not trip. There is a last little oath on the oar, which is less a promise than a habit saying goodbye to itself inside a throat. And then the harbor resets to its default setting of ordinary religion, barrels minding their own hoops, gulls attending their noisy church, and the sea taking coins so gently you would think it were tidying its pockets. It might be asked whether Ran ever spends what she gathers. The sagas are suggestive and vague, as sagas like to be when the weather is too comfortable for heroics. They give us the image of a house beneath the surface where a matron counts not money but stories, each bead a story head, each clipped edge a decision. The idea that God's tally currency would be dull even for gods. It is more satisfying to suppose that she is interested in the exact sound a coin makes when it parts from a finger. If you have ever dropped a button into a jar late at night and felt the quiet catch it, you have the scale of the thing. So we drift on because drifting is the correct speed for learning a lesson that cannot be finished. And we let the sea keep what it keeps. The net holds. The boat breathes. The crew count and are counted. What comes back to shore is not only fish or stories, but a way of talking that does not wake anybody. If you try to measure the whole custom with logic, it will float away and wave from a safe distance. Better to make tea, warm the cup, and rehearse the names of waves under your breath like a prayer that requires no deity, only patience. Later, if you like, you can practice tying a clove hitch around a little coil of sleep and set it where it once fall. The sea will check it, find it decent, and move on to the next boat that remembers to pay a small tax in gold and a large tax in humility. And as the day folds back into that first gray page with ripples for lines, you might hear the oars falling into their slow conversation. Waterwood, the kind of talk that has no point except to continue. A fog bead clings to the prow and does not vote. A bell somewhere mistakes noon for morning and is forgiven. The ring touches black water and decides it is enough to be briefly colder than usual. If you're still awake, you can stay for another tide, and we'll practice greeting. Defa and Anar and their sisters, until your tongue knows the sequence better than the clock knows minutes. If not, let the inventory finish itself without you. The net will close with no sound. The ledger will chalk a line of light where your boat passed. and you will turn in your sleep like a small wave remembering a shore it met once and liked, perhaps because the shore did the simple, beautiful thing of staying exactly where it was put. You would think the road to the underworld would publish a timetable, but it prefers snow and distant bells instead. In the north, there is a way that is not exactly a path, more like a patient intention that keeps walking after your feet sit down. The first sign is a bridge that doesn't care for introductions. The second is another bridge that nods at your memory as if it recognizes your boots. And then there are 7 more because 9 is a number that belongs to the north, the way teaspoons belong to tea. Each plank carries a footprint the way a pan holds yesterday's warm. Not hot, not cold, just companionable. If one plank creaks, it is not complaining. It is remembering a traveler who stepped a little too hard because supper was nearly earned and the wind had opinions. By the last span, even your thoughts step softly so as not to wake the dark. People say Hell's Gate is reached by hurrying, but that is just the north telling a joke in a voice made of pine breath. If you're still awake later, feel free to subscribe to more long explanations of short distances if you're asleep. I'll assume your pillow clicked the button for you and we'll both be satisfied. The bridges cross fords where watchers sit, which sounds severe but is very pastoral. A hound lifts its head without standing and lets its nose be the tollhouse bell. The river keeps its own ledger under a blanket, waiting for the right name to enter itself. A woman with a ledger listens more than she looks. In the sagas, she rarely gets a line, yet everyone knows she is there, keeping the arithmetic of breath. The gate does not ask you a question, which is a relief, because tests at thresholds are unfair. It listens for the answer you brought along without saying it out loud. The law here is older than voice. A person may carry iron or bread or frost, but what the gate notices first is the way the body has placed its name, and how tightly the name is held between teeth, in the palm, or like a coin sewn into the hem. The practical ones keep a byname, a road name, and a name for lending to rain. And this is considered tidy, not excessive. Somewhere a scholar will tell you the North loved kennings and stacked metaphors like driftwood. Out here the habit is less poetic and more like carrying 3 keys on a ring in case one bends. Names are coin here, and nicknames are copper you can spend in the small market between snowdrifts. A byname buys you time. A deed name buys distance. The birth name stays wrapped like dead linen. Each syllable leaves a small warmth in the air, the way a breath mist writes on glass. Old stories experiment with this. A man who called himself Otter could trespass on certain banks. A woman named for Ash could cross last night's fire without argument. It is not sorcery so much as etiquette between things that notice each other. The toll of hell is not an amount measured by scales. It is a decision you make about which name the day can afford to lose. Some travelers keep a winter name specifically for narrow bridges, a name large enough to pay the fee but small enough not to be missed by morning. Others carry a borrowed name from an ancestor, the way you carry a spare glove. The gate is lenient with family items. There is a ledger of memory, and it writes in frost that melts after the traveler has passed. Debts are recorded as echoes, credits as lighter footprints on return. Entries may be sealed by a tear, but sometimes the clerk prefers a laugh shared at the post, which dries quicker and does not smudge. Nothing is crossed out. Things are allowed to fade at their own pace, like chalk on a door that receives more weather than visitors. Some say the ledger keeps 2 columns, one for names offered and one for names returned thinner from the journey, so you can hold them to the light and see where the day ate a little. Others say there is only 1 column and a great deal of white space, which feels truer to anyone who has spent time with snow. Either way, the book is not heavy. It is a habit held in the hand of the cold. If the ledger is the book, Hell's Hall is the reading room, and it does not hurry. Benches accept weight without a creak. A cup warms the hands first and the mouth second, which is correct hospitality for people who have been speaking in weather for too long. Bread is broken with a nod toward those who cannot come back for more. Salt sits near the elbow like a small promise reaching past pride. Silence serves as the tablecloth and is never stained. The room counts breaths instead of minutes. It turns out that time is more respectful when it is tallied by chess rather than by bell, and the bell seems to appreciate the holiday. There is a small brazier that pretends to be a sun. It does well enough in the corner, and you admire it for trying. The questions aloud are not the questions people expect to ask at gates. How long, how far, and who may turn again are measured, not declared. Answers arrive like snow, distinct at the edge, soft by the time they land. The best maps are drawn in steam on clay and left to dry into advice. No one is hurried. Even time keeps its hat in its hands here. It is not that hell demands quiet the way a library does. It is that noise seems to tire faster this far from noon. In the corner, there is a coat rack that appears to have grown in place. On it hangs a traveling name or two, drying into smaller sizes, the way wool decides to be conservative after a washing. When someone smiles at you, it is usually for the sturdy reason that you have remembered a custom they had also remembered, and two memories agreeing is pleasant. Returning is done without rattle because the world does not need to be alerted more than necessary. Knots are untied in the reverse order and counted under the breath like the softest of spells. A footprint is brushed once forward and once back to even the ground. The hound is thanked with a palm shown empty of fear and full of respect. At the bridge post, a promise is hung where it can weather and hold. These posts look like ordinary uprights until you notice that they carry 100 little strings with dates when people decided to become slightly better at something unambitious. The river forgets quickly and kindly, which is one of water's main trades, though it advertises none of them. There is a bedtime hypothesis in the North that if doors eat noise, then quiet is a key that never leaves a pocket. People try not to say last name or real name too loudly because names do not require that sort of drama to function. They prefer to be called best for winter or safe for markets. The road home prefers steady steps and no stories until morning. Past a certain frost line, wrists rehearse the feeling of letting go of one syllable and keeping another. It is like counting coins and mitten slow, certain, oddly satisfying. By the time you reach the soft slope before the first farm, the world has resumed its ordinary religion of chores. The cow still believes in hay. The smoke worships roofs with its whole heart. No one agrees when the custom began, which is another way of calling it old. Some say the price of passage started when people first noticed that their breath left the mouth like a little traveler itself and wondered whether breath might have its own gate at which it pays a vowel. Others think the habit grew around bridges the way moss does, killing nothing, improving everything, making a vertical place feel like a horizontal one. There's also the practical theory that names are the only luggage light enough to be taxed every day without breaking hearts. Whatever the reason, the result is stabilizing. You take care where you put your syllables, and the world respects careful people the way shelves respect balanced jars. Hell herself appears in the stories neither cruel nor cheerful, which is a refreshing stance in a supervisor. Half this, half that, as if she were the weather remembering 2 counties at once. She prefers exact change and unembarrassed faces. Children in the stories are told that shouting their whole name at the river is like giving a loaf to a tidal wave. Admirable, but it doesn't stick where you hoped. Better to pinch off a crust, say, for passage, and eat the rest with butter later. The older people keep their names in layers like winter clothing, and you can always tell which layer is being offered by how their shoulders roll it forward. A nickname with a shrug, a kin name with a nod, a bone name with a stillness that makes conversation sit down for a moment. In the hall that does not hurry, you learn a few micro rules that never make it into the sagas. Never loan out a name that your grandmother might need. If you must borrow a name, return it rinsed and folded. When you cross the threshold, let your borrowed syllable go first so it can check the temperature. If you happen to be given a name by a rock, this does happen in the north. Usually on foggy afternoons, keep it in your pocket with the smooth side facing your palm and the scratchy side facing your phone, and both will behave. On especially clear mornings, people go into the field and practice saying themselves smaller and larger, like adjusting flame under a pot, and then walk home feeling correctly warmed. The practice has gentle side effects. Markets are calmer when everyone has a coin of self to keep track of. Boats leave on time when crew and tide have already exchanged introductions and a modest toll. Corals slide off door frames because no one wants to spill what they might need at the ford. Even gossip grows polite, which is to say it becomes accurate and brief. If you overpay shouting say 3 names at once because you re-worried about missing your turn, the ford returns change in the form of a dream where you discover a small pocket sewn into your sleeve and wake with the feeling there is exactly enough of you left to do the day. On the maps of poets, which are reliable in their own slippery way, the roads to the north of night are drawn as thin threads that loop 9 times and then tie themselves in a respectable bow. The practical maps are simpler, 1 line from breath to breath. The bridges along the way keep the same policy year after year. No toll for stories, modest charge for boast. Companion discount if you speak kindly to your own shadow. During festivals, when people walk out to the 9th span just to watch the dark think, the hound at the toll house sleeps with its chin on its paws and dreams of snow that smells like bread. If you have ever whispered your full name to a mirror and felt suddenly overfurnished, you understand the problem this custom solves. Names can be heavy, especially in good boots. The gate invites you to carry only what you need for the length of 1 bridge. A syllable handed over is like a mitt dropped at the door of a warm room. You will collect it when you go. On the way back, you may find it has shrunk half a size, and that is all right. Many things learn to fit you better after a quiet. We could talk about the legal aspects, the trials where judges weighed a deed name against a by name and wrote opinions that were essentially recipes for fairness. We could recite little-known clauses. A winner name cannot be confiscated. A marriage name may be halved, and later rejoined without penalty. A traveling name is not admissible as evidence in matters of pride. But legalities put on armor, and we are here for wool. The custom works because no one wishes to be that person at the ford who paid with the wrong syllable and had to clap their pockets. While the water waited, you choose carefully. You place it in the ledger with 2 fingers. The page relaxes. Some evenings the hall sets out extra cups for those who will pass without stopping. The cups are empty and still comforting. Stew lifts its lid and looks interested in whoever might be hungry tomorrow. Salt rehearses being an answer to a small question. It is all preparation, community theater for quiet. The watchers at the ford rehearse lowering their eyes so travelers do not trip over too much attention. The bridges oil their sighs. In the corner, a child learns to spell their winter name like an adult who is good with lists. Someone tries on a new by name for half an hour and decides it fits like a second best coat, which is perfect for rain. By now the night has drifted near, not as a threat, but as an excellent blanket that takes requests. If it feels like I am speaking for too long about planks and ledgers and unexciting tolls, that is the point. These are the parts of the world you fall asleep by, the way you fall asleep by a clock that keeps an old promise every minute. When you finally stand to go or dream of standing to go, the road will be there, and the first bridge will accept your weight and your quiet, and the river will keep, counting like a careful cashier who has all evening. Offer a name the way you would offer a glove to your colder hand. Keep another for the pocket. Let the last one stay home and watch the light. And if you return lighter than you left, that is not loss. It is simply the north making room in you where more calm can live. Spilling no sound, just a little frost dissolving on a page that knows how to wait. You might not expect the sea to keep an invoice, but sailors in the north said it did, written in mist and settled by the weight of a small coin. At the start of a voyage, they treated the water like a host, a judge, and a second stomach that needed a token to stay quiet. Someone lifted a coil of rope with the hush that people use for quilts, not tools. Someone else set out a cup of ale and a finger's weight of gold, just enough to feel cold and decisive on the palm. The prow trembled the way a bench does when a heavy friend sits down carefully. Names for the waves were spoken as if greeting an old, complicated family at a reunion where everyone brought wind. Sailors claimed the daughters of the sea had 9 moods, and they addressed them one by one, not to flatter, but to label the weather like jars on a shelf. It was easier to study the mind if each slosh had a name. Counting words became a kind of rope. The deck breathed with the tide. The lamps agreed to be low. The ring used for oaths touched black water and came back colder, which everyone accepted as a signature from below. If you remain awake long enough for me to reach the topic of not etiquette, feel absurdly free to subscribe. If you are asleep by then, I'll mark you down as a satisfied customer of silence with no further action required. They said Ran, the sea wife, threw a net finer than rain and kinder than most arguments. It closed without sound. People did not describe the chords themselves. They described instead the moment a boat stopped bickering and began to listen. Sailors like to think that when the hull shivered in a certain way, they had been scooped very gently into a hand they couldn't see. Survivors of storms spoke of being set back on the skin of the sea, the way a steady palm sets a loaf back on its cooling board. No miracles, just a return to plain contact. Because the sea keeps appointments with the moon, people felt obliged to keep small appointments with the sea. They paid what they called sea fire, which sounds dramatic until you realize it means the smallest coin you can spare given quietly before the wake begins. Gold became sea fire because it answered darkness rather than defeating it. It shone without asking to be noticed. A brooch, a bead, a clipped coin tiny, almost embarrassed payments. Excess was considered rude offshore, the way wearing a fur coat to someone else's oven is rude. The gift was small on purpose. When the metal left your palm, talk left your mouth for a while and settled somewhere peaceful in the ribcage. The quiet law of water had 3 habits. First, treat the sea as a room you have entered, not a floor you are conquering. Second, remember that waves have names. Not magical names, but helpful ones like labels on weather that keep the mind from sprinting. Third, before the boat is fully awake, give the sea its due as if paying rent to a very patient landlord who never raises the price and never forgives lateness. People like to tell a story about a captain who forgot the coin and was reminded by a gull that landed with the board weight of a tax collector. The gull pecked the edge of the cup, not because gulls understand finance, but because sometimes the world sends a bird to tap your memory. On mornings when the fog beaded along the prow like soft armor, the helmsman would name the daughters one more time, not because he believed lists were sacred, but because lists slow the mouth to the pace of weather. Naming kept courage from outrunning caution the way a leash keeps a friendly dog from being too friendly with a cliff. Nets and knots were the grammar of this courtesy. A net has a way of making space behave itself, as though holes could be persuaded into neat ranks. Ran's net, so the old sailors said, noticed moods before it noticed men. Boats that thrashed got the slower weave. Boats that exhaled got the quick silk. Either way, the chords worked like a lullaby sung to planks. Knots were the punctuation. There was the hitch you tie when you mean to change your mind later, and the bend you use when you are ready to tell the day, firmly, that you will be returning. There was one oath knot meant only for weather, which you cinched with your breath held, a tiny pause offered to the wind as a respectful nod. Knots marked home ports. Each safe landfall untied one without ceremony, like ticking off a chore on a friendly list. The habit of speaking to rope is not superstition so much as recognition. Rope is a technology that likes conversation. If you have ever explained your printer to your printer and felt it begin working again, you understand this. The price, mercy, and etiquette of the sea formed a small triangle you could fold into a pocket. The price was the coin, given with the palm low, away from the eyes, because generosity prefers shade to glare. The mercy was the remembering that loss is tallied quietly. Grief likes neither trumpets nor deadlines. Sailors came home with many states of not lost. A rope from the wreck, a chest, a name, sometimes a goose feather that had the good manners to point home. People wrapped tokens and kept them, not worn, simply kept. Memory became ballast. It steadied more than stone could. The etiquette was to promise simply, watch the weather, respect the shoal, count the crew aloud. Oaths on the oar were sworn with one hand on the loom and one on the thwart, which meant you vowed in the position of ordinary rowing. Vows given at the height of ceremony can be dramatic. Vows given in the posture of chores tend to survive weekday afternoons. Discipline was devotion that learned to row. The sea liked that kind. It is difficult to prove the sea likes anything, but sailors continue trying. It gives them something tidy to do between clouds. Sometimes the price you paid was not for rescue, but for memory's measurements. Loss is never itemized up front, so a little retainer felt wise. It taught people to count what stayed. You might leave with 14 small arguments and return with only 6. This is savings. You might leave with a loud name and return with a name that learned to make tea. This is wealth. When a storm forgot a rope and left it looped over a rock like a scarf after a party, finders carried it back to the shore or to a shrine, whichever came first. Found gold was returned to water before it bought anything else, like letting a coin see its birthplace before it begins its loud career in markets. At the slip, at the end of a crossing, someone tapped the gunwale once in farewell, the way one taps a friend's shoulder in a crowded door. Knots were opened and coiled with thanks. A lantern was shaded so people could look each other in the face without squinting. Tomorrow's rope was laid out straight so dawn would not trip. The harbor closed as softly as a book being returned to its shelf in a quiet room that trusts you. All of this was unremarkable in the way the best furniture is unremarkable. It holds you without making a speech about support. When strangers asked why gold and not silver, the answer was usually a shrug shaped like a proverb. Gold keeps its temper in salt, silver forgets itself. Also, the poets had already called gold the sea's fire, so the choice came partly pre-labeled, which saves a lot of committee time. There is a gentle irony in paying the sea with the sun's color. It is like thanking a baker with a photograph of daylight. Yet people swore the coin was accepted, perhaps because it delivered stillness to the hand that let it go. There is no receipt for stillness, but there are symptoms. The oars make less noise. Your neighbor becomes easier to like. Even the gulls circle without editorializing. Micro-customs accreted around the main habit the way shells accrete around patience. Some crews kept a box of lint and thread ends to give overboard, calling it the mending tax, a charitable donation to whichever wave had to patch itself that day. Others set a crumb of bread aside for the ninth daughter, in case she was busy when the stew was ladled. It is never wrong to portion for an absent guest who might arrive hungry. When someone new joined the boat, an older hand quietly taught them how to listen to planks. You place your fingers just so on the rail and wait. If the wood feels like a cat pretending not to purr, the tide is pleased. If it feels like a table that wants coasters, you adjust the trim. This is not science, and yet it keeps people employed and noticing, which is sometimes better. The names of waves became a game on long afternoons. Sailors had sets like cards, pulling one to match the day's hand. There was the wave that sounded like a broom at the back door. There was the one that tried to talk, failed, and was satisfied with humming. My favorite is the wave that behaves like a helpful ant, smoothing your hair before you face the wind. Children listening at the pier learned the names the way they learned bread manners. If a young one called a cross chop by the wrong cousin name, the old one smiled and corrected with the excessive tenderness usually reserved for bread just beginning to be bread. And sometimes the sea punished nobody and the day still went wrong, because the world is not a barter system. It only looks like one from the right angle. Even then, people said the coin had done its work. It had taught a hand to open. Of course, there were debates. Did the sea prefer round coins because circles are a form of politeness? Was a brooch better than a bead because it had heard more stories? There was a case of tragic comedy when a certain crew paid in brass by mistake and wondered why the next morning a fog the taste of pennies held them by the cheek. They corrected themselves. The fog released them with a single soft cough, like a librarian reshelving a book in the right section. A learned man once argued that Ran, being famously fond of gold, would not be impressed by a coin the size of a fingernail. A learned woman replied that being fond of gold is precisely why a deity would recognize the effort to keep most of it. Restraint is a prayer with excellent manners. It did not escape notice that the sea collected names as well as coins. The quietest rolls in any port were the lists of boats that had changed names after a hard season. The practice was not superstitious repainting. It was a way of folding old luck and laying out new. Sometimes a ship only soft a vowel, like massaging a stiff joint. The scribes kept both versions on record as politely as you keep the family version of a recipe next to the written one. At leave-taking, the new name was spoken last and lowest, like a secret told to a friendly wall. If you're still awake, the etiquette is to approve silently. If you're asleep, we will assume you nodded. Even the storms learned their manners, or so sailors said when they wanted to be on speaking terms with inevitability. There is a kind of weather that arrives like an officious cousin and leaves like a good guest. The coin, the cup, the naming, and the knots made such weather more likely, or else they made the crew notice the merciful parts of bad hours. Either way, mercy was circulated. When you came home, people asked first about supper, and second about the sea, and you were allowed to answer those questions in either order. The fire was allowed to pretend it had kept the house warm alone, and nobody corrected it. A boat that had paid its coin and told its knots, the truth creaked like a floorboard that knows who lives here. We could go on, and the sea certainly does. Another lamp would be trimmed. Another coin would learn the short way from hand to dark. Another name would be borrowed from a wave and returned by evening. The nets would be patched with patience, which is stronger than twine and cheaper than bragging. Somewhere a ledger would be opened, not the kind with columns, but the kind that sits quietly in the chest where a grandmother keeps buttons, useful for every fabric and room for none. You would sleep while the tide walked up to the harbor's lip, and then, deciding not to knock, went for a stroll along the moon. You would imagine that somewhere below, a net as soft as rain is counting boats and deciding to be kind again. And I would keep describing these unurgent errands of water until description itself were a comfortable hole, the sort of hole you poke in a wilf to see if it has risen, the sort of hole that lets steam and fret slip away while the sea keeps breathing and the gold stays cool and the day forgets to hurry. You might not expect a gate to prefer quiet names over loud gold, but the North had a habit of paying tolls with syllables, and the people who traveled by starlight learned to carry their names like clean coins in a warm pocket. The road to Hell's Gate, they said, started in an ordinary field where frost liked to copy the shape of straw, and if you left before supper and walked with the patience of a kettle simmering on low, you reached the first of 9 bridges just as the sky began practicing night. Each bridge remembered weight. Planks retained a traveler the way a spoon remembers the taste of honey. The first span noted your height. The second measured your sigh. The third bridge counted the times your thoughts went off to look for a warmer hat and came back without one. By the last span, Even your anxieties tiptoed, not out of fear, but out of courtesy for whatever the dark was trying to dream. And if you were somehow still awake when I reached the part about the ledger with the tidy handwriting, you're welcome to subscribe or to blink slowly in a way that implies you meant to do that later. Either option will be logged as excellent life management. The road kept to the north of night, which is to say the cold was honest and the stars were punctual. People traveled in singles or in pairs, but rarely in threes, because three invites conversation, and conversation invites opinions, and opinions have a way of echoing off iron and sounding like somebody knocking. The old advice said to treat every bridge like a librarian's desk. You cross with the weight of the book you borrowed and of the book you forgot you borrowed, and you understand that both are being handled. Somewhere after the fifth bridge, you could smell kitchens at the farms you had left behind, smoke and bread and the hint of onions, a little proud of themselves. Past the seventh span, the wind decided whether to travel with you or to sit this one out and keep the frost company. The ninth bridge took your full attention the way a needle takes cloth, quick and precise. You put one foot down as if placing it on a sleeping cat that, in this metaphor, approves. No one hurried. Even time kept its hat in its hands. On the far side of the crossings, the watchers kept an office that looked like a ford, though in poor light it could have been a hallway or the calm stretch of speech before a question. You knew you had reached them when a hound lifted its head without standing, as if a bell had rung in its nose. The animal never growled. It had the expression shared by night guards and bakers, calm ownership of an important nothing. They said the river itself wore a blanket, which is a poetic way to admit there was often fog. A woman with a ledger sat by the bank. She wrote with a stylus that left shallow trails, the sort of writing that relies on honest paper. She asked your name once, not the long proud chain of it, just the one you could answer while warming your hands. It was important not to inflate the answer. Names behave better when they arrive in their everyday shoes. The woman looked more than she listened, but her looking was a kind of listening. It took in your face like a hearth takes in a log, changing nothing about its shape and everything about its warmth. What she recorded, the elder said, was the truth that had reached you. Perhaps you were called by a nickname that fit like a hat now bent to your head. Perhaps there was a travel name you had used for this road alone, the way a kettle earns a winter name. And perhaps there remained a birth name folded away like a dress coat. You didn't have to unpack it. Names in the north were considered garments relative to the weather. The gate at the end of the world was less interested in ceremony than in whether you had brought a word that could keep you modest company. I have met people who carry backpacks of monikers like souvenirs. The watchers preferred one syllable reasonably awake. It saved everyone the trouble of counting, and counting, out here, was for bridges. If the bridges were the soft math of the journey, the toll house was its arithmetic. True names were iron keys. Nicknames were copper you could spend without remark. The price of passage was not a fee, but a wait what part of your call you were ready to set down, so the gate would hear your steps honestly. A byname could buy time the way a borrowed cloak buys you a mile in winter. A deed name bought you distance, the kind you win by doing a task repeatedly until the task agrees you may do it. Birth names were kept wrapped like bright coins in a purse that did not need to be shown. People misunderstood this as mystery. Really, it was simple bookkeeping. Each syllable carried a small warmth into air, the way breath gives glass a brief cloud. You spent one gust of self on the threshold and another on the question after. The woman with the ledger had the expression of someone who knows where every cup is in a kitchen. She did not smile often, but when she did, daylight checked its work and found it accurate. The ledger of memory was, as ledgers tend to be, more interesting than expected. The pages were light, the color of old answers. When you passed, a line was written with frost that would melt by morning. Debits were recorded as echoes, the times you used your name to impress a table. Credits were lighter footsteps, the days you set your name down and did the work without touching it. Some entries received a seal, which might be a tear or a laugh shared with the watcher, or occasionally the kind of quiet that arrives after you unthinkingly say the thing you meant to say. Nothing was crossed out. Items were allowed to fade at their own pace, like chalk weathering into the idea of chalk. The old taught the young to read this book the same way one learns where a river is shallow, by attention that remembers to be gentle. How heavy was your name today? Heavy enough to anchor a promise, light enough to carry it the rest of the way. Beyond the ledger, there stood the hall that does not hurry. The door was always a little bit open. Benches inside accepted weight without creak, which everyone agreed was the sign of furniture that has met many shoulders and judged none of them surprising. Bread waited in loaves that understood they were loaves and not quilts. Knives made clear cuts and asked no questions. Bread, salt, and silence were the first three offerings. The bread warmed hands first and mouth second. The salt was set near the elbow where you could find it without looking. Silence acted as the tablecloth and consequently never stained. Conversation in that room never began with, "I heard," and certainly not with "you should." The longest speeches were about weather, but not the exciting parts, just the dependable news a sky gives to anyone who stands under it. Hospitality, there was not softness. It was order that kept blades asleep and let hunger finish one thing before it started the next. You were allowed to ask practical questions. How long? How far? Who may turn again? These were measured, not declared, the way you measure flour for a cake when you are unhurried enough to level the cup. Answers arrived like snow, distinct at the edge, soft by the time they landed. Maps were drawn in steam on clay and left to dry into advice. If someone asked whether the hall belonged to Hell, Death's careful host, the room let the question pass like a draft and closed the crack quietly later. The point was not ownership. The point was service. Even the fire understood hierarchy. In this hall, things were often exact and seldom loud. You noticed the warmth, you noticed the bench, you notice your own breathing behaving itself. It is hard to overstate the comfort of a room that expects nothing but your being there on purpose. When it came time to leave, the returning without rattle began. Knots were untied in reverse order, counted under the breath the way one unknits thinking. A footprint was brushed once forward and once back to even the ground. This was not to hide where you had gone, merely to tell the path it had done fine work and could relax. The hound was thanked with a poem shown empty of fear and full of respect, which amounts to the same posture. That is an excellent secret to remember in other parts of life. At the bridge post, travelers hung a promise where wind and weather could test it. A good promise weathers and holds, and if it takes on a little gray, that is not decay, but proof that it lived outdoors. People kept their hats in their hands a moment longer than needed, as though part of them might still be leaving and part of them had already come home. Unsuspending a name was the last small task. While crossing the bridges, you had set parts of your name to hang like little bells that warned the dark you were coming. Now you lifted them down. Each syllable fit back into your pocket like a folded note. Some people returned with shorter names, relieved of letters they had outgrown the way feet outgrow a boot. Others kept the same name, but it sat differently, closer to the center of gravity. A few borrowed a new by name from the watchers, who like most clerks are excellent at nicknames neat, descriptive, quietly fond. A woman who always arrived on the last flicker of the lamp became last light. A man who spent a long time deciding, and then always decided kindly was called after. The hill kept a list of these in polite frost for a day or two, then let it fade with precisely the right amount of ceremony. There's a bedtime hypothesis, much favored by elders who loved theories that did not wake anyone. It says that if doors creak, then quiet is a key that never needs a pocket. A name is best when it opens what you are trying to open and then forgets to take credit. The watchers never tested this hypothesis aloud. They simply noticed that the road home prefers steady steps and no stories until morning. If you made the trip for grief, the hall let grief sit by the fire and roll its shoulders. If you came for counsel, the hall gave you bread that tasted like answers, which is to say, it tasted almost exactly like bread. Those who returned to farms and towns carried back a way to lay down their hat without thinking, and a way to say thank you that made the air agree with their mouth. Sleep learned their feet, and their feet learned the floorboards, and the house kept the night quiet for them the way a mother cat keeps a box of kittens both visible and safe. You might think all this rather bureaucratic for a mythic border, but there is a clean beauty in rules that exist to keep everyone from needing too much courage at once. The North did not believe in abolishing problems. It believed in teaching them how to be civil. Even Hell's Gate worked that way. Iron Links answered once and then rested. If someone arrived carrying a story large and fresh and sharp, the chain vibrated politely and then became still, to remind the traveler that there is a better time for sharpness than the minute before salt. When you told your name, the listener's eyes did the work of warm water, taking the stiff out, leaving the shape. The ledgers did not survive in any museum, of course. Frost makes poor archives. But many kitchens in many villages kept an empty book by the window and let the cold write in it at dawn. Children traced the letters and found them to be exactly the right difficulty, not impossible, just slippery. Sometimes a person would return from the hall with a new habit of measuring distance, not by miles, but by breaths that did their job. How far did you go? About 40 calm breaths and 2 that needed a reminder. This sounds ridiculous until you try it and discover that breath is the most honest clock you own. It does not exaggerate. It also does not play favorites with thoughts. On winter evenings, men and women who had made the crossing sat with their neighbors and mended harness or nets. And while their fingers worked, they explained the questions the hall allows and the ones it quietly hands back to you. Boys who like to ask about monsters were told there are none that sit on benches. Girls who like to ask whether they would be remembered were told that even bread is remembered, which is why people wrap it. This arranged everyone very pleasantly for sleep. I realize we have been walking a long time. That is the point. The road is not interested in arriving as much as it is in continuing. There is always another frost-scribed line in the ledger of morning, always another bridge that prefers one careful footfall, always another small promise to hang for the weather to test. The hound at the ford grows older, as hounds do, but its nose still rings the toll house bell, and its ears know the shape of your name, whether you speak it or not. The woman with the ledger looks up, writes, looks up again, the exact rhythm of tide. She will not rush you. The hall will not hurry. The bread will warm the hands first, and the mouth second. And even after the last key is warmed in a palm and tucked away, there is the soft work of leaving without noise, which is a craft as satisfying as tying a perfect knot in a rope that no one will see and everyone will trust. We could list the bridges again, the watchers again, the questions and the unsuspending, the way one hums a tune until the tune forgets it was ever meant to end. If you are still listening, your breath has probably found a steady pattern like footsteps on well-educated planks. If you have already drifted, the road will continue at the speed of your sleep, and the gate, which prefers quiet, will be pleased. Nothing dramatic waits there, only a table that has learned the exact distance between bread, salt, and the place where hands rest when they are done proving themselves. The ledgers will frost and melt and frost again, growing ever more correct. And I will keep speaking slowly about the simple accounting of names, and about the way a bridge carries not just weight, but worry, and about the kindness of a dog who rings a bell with its nose, until the story thins to the good kind of silence and your own name, meanwhile lies down beside you like a key under a soft cloth, not lost, not loud, simply ready. You might not expect a rainbow to need polishing, but the North was practical about miracles, and somewhere near the hour when Porch lamps yawn and Frost thinks about its schedule. The bridge they called Bifrost received its quiet care. The span looked bright to everyone except the people who worked on it. They had the patient eyes of those who know what gleam looks like when it has eaten breakfast and what gleam looks like when it has not. They walked with soft steps because it is considered impolite to startle color. The bridge was awake but not busy, and that, they said, was the best time. If you are still awake yourself by the time we finished discussing dew viscosity and the correct angle for a starlight squeegee, you may subscribe, or you may let your phone slide onto your pillow like a little shield going off duty. Either choice will be counted as participation and rewarded with a very dignified nod from the evening. They began by checking the lamps that pretend to be stars along the handrail. The lamps are not stars, but they dress like them and have perfected the imposture with such sincerity that actual stars refuse to complain. Each lamp was tapped once with a knuckle, so that humored light moved through its glass like a thought through a polite mind. An apprentice counted colors under her breath to make sure the ordering hadn't slipped during wind. Red, then orange, then yellow, then your opinion of sunlight, then green, then the blue that knows about wells, then the blue that knows about winter, and finally violet, which always lingers a little as if waiting for shoes. Color has to be counted in this order because when you count it the other way, it starts to loop back, and that is charming but unhelpful. The counting was not for the bridge. The bridge remembered itself perfectly. It was for the people. Counting calmed the hands. Heimdall, who kept watch. He did not supervise. He has the sort of presence that makes supervision unnecessary, like a lighthouse that has learned to say, It is said he sleeps less than birds and hears grass grow, and while this sounds like a terrible burden, it turns out to be useful when someone drops a rag. His teeth are gold, which is not bragging but an inventory fact. He held a horn he rarely blew, the big round one, but he also had a smaller horn in his pocket that was a thermos for coffee. He admitted nothing about this, and so no one had to notice. When the bridge creaked, it was not from age but from politeness. Old structures clear their throats modestly before holding weight again. A bucket of dew was carried up by someone who had opinions about buckets. Dew is graded, of course. Field dew is different from fjord dew. Pine dew remembers needles. Roof dew remembers conversations. For Bifrost, you want the dew that collects on the thin grass right at the edge of streams where cows sip in the afternoon and forget to trample later. It is light and a little surprised. Poured from elbow height onto a linen pad, it listened well. With the pad, they swept the red in long steady arcs that ended exactly one palm width beyond where a foot would land. The trick, a mentor said, was not to make the red redder. The trick was to let red be red without the little sigh it sometimes picked up from travelers who took their errands too seriously. The pad handled sighs. The bridge handled feet. Every 30 or 40 heartbeats, someone checked the buttresses with a hand. Bifrost anchors into places people like to call the sky and the ground, but really it bites into habit. Habit holds better than stone, and that is why the bridge is so trustworthy. They touch the fasteners with fingertips warmed on a pocket stone. Warm fingers find wobble more precisely than eyes do. It was a simple sequence. Tap, listen, move on. The only sound they did not like to hear was enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is splendid in song and dangerous in masonry. One laborer told the others about a time a very excited hero ran across the bridge in armor that jingled like an optimist. The bridge forgave the jingling but suggested, by way of a smooth slip under the heel, that rhythm exists for a reason. No one fell. Everyone adjusted. At intervals they paused to let moonlight settle, because if you polish through a settling, the gloss later refuses to lie down properly, and you wind up with what professionals call a proud spot. You don't want proud spots on a public bridge. They make travelers stop and reflect on themselves at inopportune angles, Long ago, someone tried using sunbeams at noon. The results were impressive and completely wrong. Bifrost prefers the hour when color can hear itself think. That is generally the hour when ovens are cooling and dogs have decided which patch of floor has won. It is a book of the work, naturally. It isn't kept on paper. It is kept in a narrow board with 6 shallow grooves and 3 deeper ones. The grooves store the memory of swipes, and at the end of the night you hold the board to your ear and it tells you whether the left side of blue needs an apology. People scoff at this until they learn to listen. Almost everything useful in the North is a listening exercise with a practical exam at the end. The apprentices smiled at the board as if it were a favorite ant who keeps giving them spoons. The ant does not explain why you need so many spoons. The ant is right. The second scene begins so gently you might not notice, the way Violet slips into the far end of the morning while you are deciding whether the day should start breeding itself. Tools were set out in a line that never changed, because creativity here is what you put into the cloth of your patience, not what you do to the layout of a tray. First came the frost brushes. They are made from the last stiff hairs on the back of old brushes that once served painters who put hole numbers on longboats. The hairs still remember numbers, which is helpful when you are brushing color back into sequential comb. After frost brushes came the ash puffs, packets of the cool ash that fires leave after they have finished being proud of themselves. Ash is the original polite material. It insists on nothing. If color starts to argue with itself, a small cloud of ash convinces it to take turns. There was also a long-handled scraper, but not for scraping. The scraper's job was to be ready in case someone said scraping would be quicker. Readiness is a kind of tool. It keeps bad ideas grateful and quiet. The handle had a mark for each time it didn't have to be used, a tradition that probably started as a joke and gradually became an accounting system for restraint. They say that when the world ends, the scraper will get its turn. The scraper is patient without being dramatic about it. Heimdall, while not supervising, made his slow patrols. He nodded to each person as if giving them a clean receipt. When he passed the place where blue bends over the yawning part of the sky, he paused. That corner holds the memory of rain promised and then canceled. Canceled rain is the most slippery kind. He laid 2 fingers there and it stopped thinking about leaving early. Facts like this are the quiet jokes of the cosmos. The man who knows 9 mothers and owns a horn too loud to name spends much of his time encouraging dampness to behave. A very small person in a very large mitten polished the handrail on the sea-facing side. He had learned the soft pressure that decides between gleam and glare. Glaring is only for shields and parents in crowded marketplaces. Bridges should gleam as if they are content to be noticed eventually. The mitten squeaked more some nights than others. Squeaks were recorded on the groove board with a dot made from pressed dew and soot. The dots did not mean anything by themselves. They meant we saw you. Most problems, it turns out, are smaller after someone says those 2 words. We can talk, if you like, about color temperatures and the small spoon method. The method is very simple. You imagine you are stirring porridge for someone who is still asleep. You don't want to wake them. You also don't want to cheat them out of breakfast. You stir accordingly. Applied to Bifrost, it prevents the red from getting ideas about torches and the green from auditioning for meadows. The bridge is not a meadow. It is a sentence between 2 clauses, neither of which wants to win. If you think that description is boring, that's good. Boring is a word for study when we are too awake to admire study properly. Travelers sometimes arrive during maintenance, which is why there were rules for crossing while the tools were out. No running, obviously. No comparing the colors out loud. The colors know when they are being compared. You may hum if you can hum in meters that match the spacing of the stones. You must look at where you will be stepping next and nowhere else. Looking anywhere else persuades the feet to invent theories. Theories are treacherous companions at the tops of things. A woman once tried to compliment the purple while walking and ended up inventing a new verb for sitting down with dignity. The bridge forgave her immediately. The verb went into circulation and has been very useful at weddings. Etiquette required that you bring your reason for crossing down to the size of your hands. Are you going to deliver a message or to fetch one? Either way, carry it in the palm behind your thumb where small objects rest and don't fret. Big reasons are allowed, but they must wait in your pocket and may not wave. Heimdall's hearing will find them if they start to do crowd work. You may ask questions if the questions are shaped like small fishing weights. How long is allowed? Will I be brave? Is not allowed, for the excellent reason that you cannot carry bravery in the hand without dropping it on your foot. Likewise, what if must stay home? What if is very clever and not very helpful around rainbows. If you come upon the workers mid-swipe, you are invited to test your footfall on the practice stripe. The practice stripe is a short stretch of spare color on the shoulder where children learn, geese refuse, and heroes are sent for a cooling lap. You place your foot and lift it and place it again until the brush hung 2 spans away feels it has made a friend. No one times you. The bridge is not in a hurry because it is famously a bridge. Nothing in the world has perfected the art of remaining where it is while pretending to go somewhere like a bridge. Between the second and third buttress, there is a small bench. This is the only seating on Bifrost, and it exists purely for the workers to have somewhere to lose track of a minute. The bench is enchanted with exactness. Sit, count 5 breaths, stand, feel completely and unremarkably better. The bench is also available to travelers who admit they forgot to breathe. One man sat and realized that his opinion about a quarrel had been standing on tiptoe. When he stood, the opinion came down to its heels and walked more comfortably. He thanked the bench. The bench has no ears. The bridge heard and was pleased. The 4th movement of the night is the tidy one. Tools in, colors checked, handrails dry. Lamps tapped once more in case any of them had decided to pretend too convincingly to be stars and need a reminder about wages. The dew bucket goes home with enough left to water a corner of moss that has been practicing patience. The ash packets are folded twice and placed under a stone that only knows the recipe for calm. Apprentices pour lukewarm water over their hands and admire how well ordinary water imitates blessing when it is tired. Someone reads the ledger of tread. This is not the groove board. This is a deep memory held by the 3rd and 5th stones from the left on the high side. They are older than their neighbors and keep track of footsteps by how much they want to be footsteps themselves. A poem would be exciting here, but the stones refuse. They give numbers with the serenity of a miller and gently underline the places where a stumble occurred and the place where a dog stopped to decide whether rainbows are for dogs. The answer, as with most questions about dogs, is yes. The worker who reads the numbers usually has pockets full of crumbs. I do not know if the crumbs are for the numbers or the worker. The worker does not either. Heimdall makes the last circle. He stops where the colors meet and leave. He turns his face enough that each hue can check itself in the gold of his teeth and feel admired in a way that does not lead to mischief. For an instant, the bridge stands there like a sentence that just discovered a precise comma. Everything relaxes into grammar. Somewhere on the far side, a rooster wonders aloud whether it is time. Heimdall puts the small horn away and pretends not to have had it. The large horn rests at his side. He will blow it exactly once in the sort of future that does not benefit from polishing. Until then, he is the sound of lookout being a daily verb. When the first traveler of morning puts a foot on red, the color accepts with that pleased heaviness you feel when a quilt covers your shoulders just right. Orange follows, not trying to be sunset, simply being the cordial cousin of fire. Yellow warms even people who claim, convincingly, to be immune to cheer. Green offers a lane for thoughts that walk instead of run. The blues, bright and deep, agree not to take themselves for ocean even though they could. Violet waits at the edge like a librarian who knows the book you want and also knows the book you will need. There is a final custom that no one mentions because mentioning it would make it look like a rule. The last worker to leave places a hand flat on the place where blue and green shake hands. The same worker then places the other hand on the face. The hands exchange a small amount of cool. The worker goes away carrying a little trustworthy quiet and leaving behind a little trustworthy warmth. This custom never started and will never end. It simply continues as long as warmth and quiet remain on speaking terms. By now, the conversation of the day has started on other edges of the world, and here, on this polite road between clauses, the night's labor has caught up with itself and sat down. We could keep talking about ash grades and do taxonomy, and the correct method for asking permission to compliment color, which is to think the compliment and let your heel do the talking. We could consider the biographies of the brushes, each a short tale about a ship and a number and a winter that looked larger from the front than the back. But you are probably 3/4 quote by now, and the bridge, if it knew you, would polish a little less bravely so as not to wake you with its shine. In an hour, the workers will be in kitchens telling no one anything remarkable. They will butter bread with the same pressure used on green. They will set the kettle just to the left of boil because left of boil has a way of making the day forgive itself in advance. Heimdall will lean in a manner that is not leaning and watch in a manner that is not staring and hold the world the way someone holds a door for people carrying bowls. He will hear the frost decide, the grass make up its mind, the long thoughts of animals, and if you stir, he will hear your pillow swear it was not the one that slipped. If you wonder during some later wakeful minute whether a crew is walking the ark again with their buckets and brushes and the affectionate patience of those who serve recurring beauty, the answer is yes, in exactly the right amount. They are always starting and always finishing and always tiding away the pride that tries to creep into colors. And every swipe is meant to keep crossing a simple act. We do these small things, the North would say, so that brave things do not have to shout when they arrive. You may close your eyes now. The lamp that pretends to be a star will keep pretending. The red will carry heavy hearts and packages with equal courtesy. The blue will hold the step of a person who cannot yet decide. And the violet, at the far edge, will wait without impatience for the sleep that crosses everything in good time. You would not think destiny needs rinsing, yet here we are at the edge of the ash tree where roots drink from an old well in 3. Women do a very normal chore with very unusual laundry. The surface looks quiet at Blue Coin without a purse, and the first dipper touches it with the gentle authority of someone who has been using the same dipper for a very long time and never once felt silly about it. You can hear the wooden lip kiss the water, and you can smell birch ash on the air. And if that sentence makes you curious, good. Curiosity is a soft towel we keep for guests. If you are still awake by the time we compare methods for hanging threads of human intention in an east wind versus a west wind, feel free to subscribe or to do nothing at all. Doing nothing is extremely compatible with fate, and the Norns accept it as a valid lifestyle. The day begins before the day admits it, which is a polite way to say early, or checks the lists. She keeps them in her headpaper mildews at the well, but she taps the rim anyway as if it were a desk, and she were a clerk who knows her pen is imaginary in Dulcin's mind. Burgundy draws water with both hands, although she could do it with neither if she liked. Happening tends to happen whether hands help or not. School ties back her hair with a line that once belonged to a ship, expecting to round a headland, and instead settled for being a hair tie across several centuries. They stand where the root crooks, like an elbow, so the pail can swing without bruising the bark. The ash tree appreciates this and creaks a couple of syllables that mean, "Thanks for not denting me," which is the polite speech of trees. You will have noticed by now that the work table is a stone. Every edge of it is rounded, not by time, but by the quiet practice of not hurrying. A row of basins sits upon the stone like clouds that forgot to float. The basins are marked in runes that announce what they hold: cold intention, warm intention, stubborn intention, and the unexpectedly delicate kind that always feels like it ought to have been stubborn but hyacinth. There is a smaller bowl for courage buttons that pop off during difficult years. People lose them, we find them, the bowl says with a shrug. The lie sits in a jar and is introduced slowly, the way you introduce cats, with respect and a willingness to back away if they make that face. When the mixture is right, a small feather floats and refuses to sink. When it's wrong, the feather reports that the world is slippery today and you should be careful of stairs. They begin with the warp of kings because kings have the least patience and they like to complain that damp destiny hangs nowhere fast. Each thread is wider than hair and narrower than a promise. It remembers fingerprints. It tries to twist into its old arguments, or hums a song that is older than the alphabet, and the thread, much younger than the song, decides to wait. Vergandi explains, as she often does, that washing is not revision. Washing is the mercy of clarity. If a stain is your nature, the lie will bow to it. If a stain is your afternoon, the lie will escort it to the door. Skuld smiles at the word door because she knows all the interesting ones and keeps them stacked in a place where no one trips. The water itself has opinions. Well, water rehearses stillness all night and then gets chatty in the mornings and compares people to geese. It says the geese are consistent and the people are not. The women listen kindly and do not argue. A drop clings to the edge of Vergandi's thumb, considering whether its future involves the basin or the stone. She says either, and the drop chooses both. If you are waiting for a riddle inside that, there isn't one. Drops prefer to be 2 stories at once. They are very modern that way. Around this hour, 2 ravens arrive and pretend to be passing through. They land on the root, fluff like old scholars, and act surprised by their own attendance. Mimin, memory, likes to inspect the clothesline as if he wrote it. Hugin, thought, stares into the pail and decides it would look better with a fish. There is never a fish. They never give up. They have a quiet arrangement with the women. For each feather they are allowed to shed near the well. They must contribute a rumor that is exactly 90% true and phrased in good grammar. Today's rumor is that someone has invented a spoon with holes in it on purpose and calls it a stringer. The women nod, add the rumor to the file of small improvements, and hand the birds a pair of lost ideas to carry back to the upper world, where someone will need them by midday. The soap is not purchased. It is rendered from ash and saved patience and a little animal fat from goats that have finished their careers. Patience is a wonderful binder. The cakes are stamped with a spiral that means, try kindness first. They lather easily and refuse to produce bubbles larger than an eyelid. Over-lathering causes folly in woven things. It makes destinies slip through fingers and pile on the floor like laundry no one wants to fold. You can see why they are careful. A world unfolds daily, and the folding takes longer than people believe. By the time the first basin has forgotten all secrets that are clean enough to forget, the clothesline is ready. It stretches from a horn of the tree to a horn of the sky. The pegs are carved from the same wood as ship's dowels, and each peg keeps the name of a shoreline where it once expected to listen to gulls all its life. Now it listens to wind instead, which is gulls with opinions removed. The line sags exactly as much as it should, and no more. Skuld measures the sag with 2 fingers and 1 eyebrow, the only instruments that never require calibration. Occasionally, she substitutes the other eyebrow for control. What you ask is actually hung on the line, not shirts. Threads, as I said, in bands of intention, but also little woven swatches that look like the squares tailors use when they ask you about cloth you cannot afford. These are sample days. If a person has 3 possible Tuesdays, the pieces for those Tuesdays hang side by side in starlight. A part-time forewoman with a very small clipboard grades the hue of each square. She marks them with a pencil that thinks it is constellations in a straight line. The pencil is wrong but confident. The square that dries first is usually the Tuesday that will happen. Not because the Norns are superstitious, but because physics is absurdly persuasive. Visitors arrive, though not many, because the path is steep and the conversation at the well is famously dull in the comforting way that good bread is dull. A farmer brings a coil of twine to trade for advice that he will not follow, because he simply wanted to be told what he was already going to do. That is the most classic transaction of all. He keeps the twine, or takes his measure with a glance and returns it to him new, which is to say he leaves with the same twine, but it has been seen, and the seeing changes the weave without rewriting it. If you're still with me, this is the less entertaining secret of prophecy. It is basically laundry that makes you consider your socks. The second scene floats in like steam when you remove the kettle just before it boils, which is incidentally the recommended way to treat many conversations. The Norns have tools and they maintain them. The long-handled fork that flips fate over halfway through drying is polished until you can see noon in it. The sieve that catches complaints is mended weekly. A hole in a complaint sieve leads to soggy laws. There is a brush for untangling threads that have begun to court each other without permission. There is a small low stool called Later, where Skuld sits when she is being very honest about tomorrow. She sits there a lot. This is also the hour of cataloging. Burgundy spreads a cloth, the gray one that remembers quiet thunder, and lays upon it all the names that came loose in the wash. Names do this. They catch on thorns of events and have tears and the roughness of doors. People are forever leaving them behind. A name on the cloth is not dangerous, but it is not trivial either. Or tastes each one the way a baker tastes batter on the back of a spoon. If the name tastes of iron, it is handed to a sword hanger. If it tastes of salt, it is stitched to a sailor. If it tastes of mint, it is saved for a child who will need to be fresh in a stale hour. If it tastes of smoke without fire, it is returned to the basin and told to try again in spring. Everything prefers spring, including the instruments of doom. They enjoy watching beans sprout like little green intentions. I should perhaps explain the quiet humor of their measurements, because humor is the oil can of serious work. String is measured by spans in size. A span is obvious. A sigh depends on who is sighing. Burgundy's sigh is medium. Hers is a dignified footnote. Skuld's sigh is a weather report. When they mark a length 2 sighs, they smile, because they have just built an inside joke into a blueprint. It keeps the formality from stiffening. Stiff cloth is for tents and stubborn castles. Destiny drapes better than that. There's a warm stone set near the well, heated in a hollow by a coal that never quite dies, and the stone serves as the iron. They lay troublesome threads on it and pass a flat piece of wood over them, which has fewer opinions than metal. Ironings happen in small strokes, like mending a sentence by moving 1 comma 3 words to the left. Great things can be altered by commas, but no one is applauded for it in the kitchen, which is another way of describing the work. During winter, the stone emits the smell of patience. During summer, it smells like the page in a book where you stopped last year. You may be wondering whether the women tell fortunes. They do not. People bring their questions anyway. Am I spared? Have I been chosen? When do I meet whom? Will the third sheaf stand? Should I become terribly famous by accident? Or gestures at the basins? Burgundy lifts a corner of cloth and shows the place where 2 colors meet and do not fight. Skuld points at the line and asks whether the wind has been paid attention to today. Usually the visitor leaves calmer and not much wiser, which is the exact dosage recommended for humans before they attempt anything important. A raven will occasionally escort them to the path, narrating historical footnotes for an audience of 1. The third glide of the day begins when sun slips through the wet weave and makes the air taste briefly like metal you are not supposed to lick. This is folding time. Vergandi's hands do the work as if two identical rivers had learned to stack. Folds are always even, not because evenness is a moral stance, but because uneven folds create memories of friction, which become superstitions at scale. A few superstitions are useful. Never whistle under a roof you didn't help build, for instance. Most only make life complicated for no reason at all, and then form committees. The women would rather avoid that. Baskets are labeled, though not with letters. The basket for late summer's wars is marked with the outline of a grasshopper leg, delicate and stubborn. The basket for epidemics is marked with a spiral that wants to behave like fungus, but has learned courtesy. The basket for weddings has a notch made by a knife that hesitated before finishing the circle. There is also a basket for the exceedingly ordinary. It is the largest, the heaviest, and the most carefully kept. Ordinary is how the world pays rent. The basket asks to be dusted twice. At odd moments, the goat that eats from the tree above. No one agrees which goat that is, and this saves arguments, lets a leaf fall. Leaves in the well are temporary visitors, but have strong opinions about meaning. They sail around in important circles until Vergandi scoops them and schedules their decay. Everything is scheduled. Even accidents have time slots, so they do not crowd. If you are suspicious of this, relax. Scheduling is not bossiness, it is a kind regard for breath. When breaths are respected, they stop startling. A young man once brought a jar to fill with fate water for his sweetheart's garden. He was given 3 ladles and a warning to keep the jar in shade. He ignored the shade part and watered the parsley at noon. The parsley became philosophical and refused to be eaten. This story is repeated to apprentices as a lesson about heat and vegetables and romance. An alternative lesson is, do the small things the way you were told the first time. It saves everyone a paragraph. As shadows lengthen like belts after a meal, the women sit and weave a few inches of something that is not assigned to any person. It is called the communal small miracle, and it is made from scraps of other hours that didn't fit anywhere. An unmissed train, a child who stops crying because a moth thumps the window in the minor key of comfort, a message that arrives at the exact moment someone decided to open the door for air. These come from the small miracle, trimmed and hemmed. It is never advertised. It is simply placed in the day where a seam shows, and then the seam stops being proud of itself. If you have ever felt helped by nothing in particular, you have worn this cloth. Now the sky begins its slow undoing of blue. The line empties. The pegs click into their box with the sound of polite bones. Rinses the basins, artfully leaving a film that will remember what work feels like. Burgundy returns the lie jar to its shelf and writes nothing down because everything already wrote itself in her muscles. Schooled unties her hair with the ship line and sets the coil on a peg to dream about harbors that haven happened. The ravens inventory the crumbs and decide that dignity is edible. A few stragglers appear with questions that are too large for their hands. How do I carry grief? The same way you carry a bucket, close to your side so it doesn't bruise your knee. When will I be forgiven? Possibly last Tuesday. Check near the faucet. Can I go back? People never go back. They go round, and sometimes the circle feels like a door. Is the world ending? Constantly in tiny pieces, the way bread ends when you eat it, and also not at all. May I buy a little good luck? It's all wholesale, sweetheart. Take the ordinary and please remember to fold. Evening finally clicks the latch on the day. The women give the well its cover, which is a lid made from night and rope. The ash tree sighs, and this one is the large sigh that means branches have done their job. A small metal cup is left near the rim for travelers who believe in last sips. The cup is dented in 3 places where heroes tried to be clever with it. The dents stand as a warning. Clever and thirsty are not friends. Drink and go. Before they leave, the women line up the baskets like a set of quiet planets. They lay their hands on the ordinary basket together and bless it with the sentence they speak only at dusk. It is not a secret, it merely dislikes being overheard. It sounds like the lid closing on a jar of sugar. It tastes like a breath taken by someone who just sat down. If you are still barely awake and listening for it, you are trying too hard and should let your pillow have the rest of the work. The path away from the well is the kind that remembers everybody the same way, a little shorter than they hoped and a little longer than they feared. Footprints on it don't last because the tree borrows them. The Norns walk it with their pails swinging empty. They walk like people who could wait out a glacier and remind the glacier to use a coaster. Behind them, the water settles into its proper circle, which is the best circle, and the goats adjust their digestion as an act of solidarity with all beings that chew. We could keep talking about how grief threads differ under moonlight, about the reasons you should never whistle near the basket marked rain, about the way names behave when they smell cinnamon in winter kitchens. We could count the pegs and tell you which ones have favorite winds. We could measure schooled sigh and compute the load-bearing capacity of hope in November. But the line is empty now, and empty lines hum in a key that invites eyelids to go down like soft shutters. Somewhere a Tuesday has dried quicker than its neighbors and is climbing into your week. Somewhere a small miracle is being cut to size. Somewhere a feather floats exactly as it should and refuses to sink, and the world, rinsed but not revised, goes on hanging itself to dry in a breeze that respects the order of things and the weight of sleep. You might expect a gate to have only one key, but the North prefers variety, so tonight there are several, all of them cool to the touch, and none of them shaped like anything helpful. They lie in a shallow wooden bowl by a door you cannot quite see. The way spare buttons gather themselves at the back of a drawer and wait for coats to remember them. The bowl is set on a stone beside a path that doesn't hurry, and the path itself takes the long way for reasons it refuses to justify. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to the practice of not asking for reasons. It costs nothing and comes with a blanket. The road to the north of night is not a road in the strict sense. It is a sequence of well-behaved ideas with stones between them. The first of those ideas is counting. 9 bridges present themselves, as polite as spoons lay in order at a feast, each with a plank that knows more than it lets on. The planks have memorized travelers, and they share stories in the minimal creaking vocabulary of wood. The light-footed ones who wore their days like thin boots. The heavy-footed ones who carried other people's names in their pockets like smooth pebbles. The rare walker who paused exactly halfway to watch a moth write its small white letter against the dark. One plank remembers a cartwheel that arrived in a mood and left in a better one. Another remembers the sound of coins that were never spent but tried to jingle convincingly anyway. None of them remember why the river runs under the bridges instead of over them. That is not their department. A breeze comes through smelling faintly of pine smoke and porridge, which lets you know how far you are from supper. The air is practice cooled, the way a basin is cool before dawn, not to punish you, but to remind your breath to stand in a sensible line. By the last bridge, where the rail has been worn smooth by more hands than can be counted conveniently on fingers, even thoughts do not wish to step too loudly. There is something about being near a threshold that teaches silence without argument. If your mind insists on busy work, the river recommends you count the circles it throws when it bumps a stone. The number is always estimate-shaped, and this is restful. After the bridges, the path slips between 2 hills and becomes a ford, as though the land decided that water should remain a participant rather than a spectator. The watchers here are unremarkable in reassuring ways. A hound crouches with the dignity of a bell that would prefer not to ring unless asked twice. Its ears report dampness levels. Its nose keeps the kind of ledger that only picks up the sense of promises. Nearby, someone sits with a ledger of the other kind, the kind that includes lines, and neat columns and a pale scar across the leather that suggests the book once debated a nail and lost politely. She doesn't demand tailies. She doesn't demand anything. She looks at the surface of the river as if it were a person answering a simple question honestly, which is rarer than you might think. You wade, not deeply, and the water is busy doing river things, moving, listening, briefly pretending to be a mirror until a ripple ruins the pose. Your knees register the temperature as a fact without opinion. The woman with the ledger nods in the manner of a clerk recognizing their handwriting. The hound's tail has small conversations with the air. The Ford asks nothing out loud, but it does care about balance. It prefers arrivals and departures to match over very wide averages, the way a careful cook prefers to return the lid to the same shelf where she found it, even if she will use it again tomorrow. On the far bank, a sliver of frost shapes itself like a key, and then sighs and lies back down as ordinary frost, which is still an achievement. The price of passage is not paid with silver. Silver is heavy and unpersuasive here. Names, however, travel lightly and convince everyone. A true name is an iron key. It opens the necessary. It weighs exactly what it ought and no more. A nickname is copper you can spend on small comforts, a fire that welcomes your boots, a cup that finds your hand as if it knew it would. A byname buys time, which is useful at borders. Your childhood mispronunciation, if you still carry it, will purchase a smile and a seat high enough that your feet swing. None of these are required. All of them are accepted. People who arrive with empty pockets discover, to their surprise, that the gate keeps a petty cash tin of old self-descriptions that were left behind by mistake. You can borrow one for the crossing. You must return it, though. The clerk is kind, but allergic to shortages. Each syllable is warmed over the breath like a spoon held above a candle. No scorch, no hurry. A name that fogs the air in the right way goes onto the tally. A name that refuses to fog is not necessarily a lie. It may simply be shy. The ledger allows for shyness. There are columns for names used and names kept, and names that were tried on once and felt like someone else's sweater. Some names are sealed with a tear because that is the only ink available at the moment. Others are sealed with a laugh that makes the iron rings along the road answer each other once, as if checking that they are still rings. It is all very quiet and extremely official in a manner that manages not to be exhausting. Beside the tally table stands another where memory keeps its own books. The pages are frost and you read them by not touching. The script forms and melts in the same stroke, a slow cursive you can feel between your eyes like the remembered shape of a road. Credits post when footsteps return, lighter and pointing the other way. Debts settle when someone says a name with the sort of authority that only comes from having told it to shut the door 1,000 times. Nothing is crossed out. Fading is permitted. The margins are generous. If you look carefully, don't. It is easy to get fond of looking. There are faint annotations, such as borrowed courage, returned with interest, and arrived angry, left with a hat. Prior to the gate itself, don't look for it. Gates dislike being looked at head on. The path wagons into a hall that avoids hurry the way a cat avoids puddles. Naturally, instinctively, without disliking puddles in principle. The benches are wood that grew up listening to wind, and they accept a person's weight without creak or comment, as if the wood had decided long ago that hosting is easier than negotiating. Bread is present, not as a performance, but as a baseline. Brown, respectable, sliced as if the knife cared about evenness. Salt stands nearby like a small lighthouse for crumbs. Cups are warm in the hands and have the decency to cool the mouth by the second sip. There is a kettle that believes in second cups and a bowl where winter apples consider their options. Here people talk less than they had expected and feel more understood than they can explain. The silence is tablecloth, not a test. You could ask questions if you like. How far? How long? How many times may I turn again? The answers arrive like snow, distinct near the edge where it meets air, soft by the time it lands. How far is measured in bridges, never in miles? How long is measured in lantern oil, which is kinder to the imagination? How many times is answered with a story about a door that learned to close itself only after learning, with equal grace, to open? As for whether you may turn again, the hall has a rule. All turning happens at corners you do not see until you have passed them. If you are awake when you turn, you get credit for style. Maps hang along the wall for those who find comfort in lines that pretend to be simpler than they are. The ink is the brown of good coffee and the blue of late thistle bloom. You can look if you're the looking type. The maps show that some roads are not roads at all, but sequences of polite houses that agree to stand in a row until you get through. Some rivers are straight out of stubbornness and others writhe with joy, and both are correct. You may bring a map with you as far as the door. After that, it turns into a handkerchief with a conveniently placed corner for tears that have announced themselves as necessary. Incorporating tissues into cartography is a quiet breakthrough no one receives awards for, which keeps it pure. The gate does not open. It agrees. Agreement sounds like iron breathing once. What you carry rattles if you let it, so people learn to fold their pockets differently. Keys go flat like fish, ready to swim. Coins are lined up by the queen's nose so they cannot clang. The doorframe considers your height and lowers itself politely for the tall. A very small bell rings in some administrative chamber a long way off, and a stamp is applied to the air near your shoulder. A stamp you cannot see, but can feel in the way your clothes suddenly fit better. It is the stamp that says you were seen, and it lasts longer than ink. Returning is underappreciated work. It begins with the unsuspending of a name, which is done in reverse order. Whatever hook held it is emptied, the knot run backward, the breath that warmed it allowed to cool itself without scolding. The ledger whisper reads your entry to you as you pass, the way grandmothers read recipes to the pot while they stir. You are thanked with the exact amount of gratitude that can be carried without spilling. At the bridge post, yes, the first one, the guardian hangs a promise where weather can see it and do its best. Promises age well in fresh air, the way cheese does, until they are ready to be cut. There's a custom, not a rule, of touching the iron link that sticks out near the end. It feels like a coin you cannot spend, which is the best kind. People touch it once and leave their name there again, not as payment, but as a forwarding address. If they come back by this road another year, the link will remember the shape and pass it along to the river, which passes it to the frost, which passes it to the kettle, which nods and makes a second cup in preparation. Networks are older than wagons. Someone once asked whether the gate is house in the possessive sense, and if so, whether she charges. The woman with the ledger looked up, smiled as if at old punctuation, and said that gates are like hearths. They belong to the house, but the house belongs to whoever is coldest. As for charge, she tapped the page where the totals usually live and showed a space as blank and dignified as a fresh pillowcase. Debts are not tallied in copper here, she said. They are tallied in size, and most have already been paid. If you want to settle something, you can do it with bread. There is a tiny oath for the road out, recited under one as breath, the way you would recite a shopping list you do not want to forget. It is not dramatic, and this is why it works. It goes more or less, I will try not to speak when listening is better. I will keep a name safe by using it correctly. I will take off my shoes when the floor asks for feet politely. Even the hound knows it, though he knows it as a wag arranged neatly into 3 parts. Outside the hall, the night makes space, and the bridges resume their count, which is 9, as always, but comfortable to say loud. The moon remembers to be where it is supposed to be, which is a kindness. The frost does its embroidery along the ditch, pulling a single white thread through black cloth and making patient leaves. You can walk without a lamp if you like. Everyone who has ever returned without rattle says that walking without a lamp teaches the ankles to write more legibly. There is no reason to doubt them. On the middle bridge, where the grain runs east-west like lines in a good palm, a traveler once sat too long and left a small round depression the exact size of a tin cup. People argue calmly about whether the cup was real. The depression is certainly there, a silence made visible, a place where you can put your own cup while you rest your hands. If you have no cup, you can put a question in the hollow. Questions fit all sorts of shapes, just as long as nobody answers quickly. Quick answers make poor tea. The fort is lower now, thinner, like soup after everyone has had some, but still rich with the herbs of motion. The woman is still at her table. She has changed nothing but the angle of her sleeve. The hound snores and pretends he wasn't, because dignity is a blanket for dogs as well as people. You hand your borrowed name back if you borrowed one. If it attached itself unexpectedly, you can keep it. Names behave like that. They become true by being worn, the way shoes become yours by developing the exact scandalous memory of your toes. People do not often bring souvenirs from this road. There's nothing to buy that is not already yours, and the gift shop is a rumor started by birds. But pockets have a way of collecting what they need. You may discover later a folded scrap of silence you didn't put there, perfect for placing between two loud hours. You may find a crumb of patience that looks like salt but tastes like thyme. You may find a smoothness on the edge of your voice where it used to catch when you said certain names. These are not merchandise. They are changes in how you carry the bowl. At home, if you have a home with a key and a door that sticks in damp weather, you slide the key in and feel it hesitate, and then you remember the iron link at the bridge, and the key remembers how to be confident on behalf of small things. The hinges sound almost like a yes. The table looks pleased to see you. Bread behaves well under the knife. If anyone asks where you've been, you can say, north of night, counting gently, paying with proper change. If they ask for a story, you can tell them you crossed a river that minded its own business, and a hall that avoided hurry, and that you returned, unspectacularly and with no rattling, and that the dog there knew all your thoughts and refused to judge them. This will not satisfy the dramatic, but it will be perfect for washing dishes. Later, as sleep notices you in the way a door notices a shoulder leaning softly against it, you might consider your names the way a clerk considers coins at the end of a quiet day. There is the one you answer to, the one your grandmother used when she needed help, the one a friend gave you for a day and never asked back, the one nobody hears because you only use it when speaking to yourself in rooms that know you. You might think of how each bought something, a pause, a kindness, a look, a way through. You might touch them in order like beads and count to 9 for no particular reason. 9 is a bridge number. It counts gently. And then you might imagine the bowl by the unseen door, the spare keys winking like cold fish, and the ledger breathing ink that becomes fog, and then nothing. You might imagine the frost writing your footsteps as a line and erasing it as mercy. You might imagine the bench that never creaks and the salt standing proud, and the cup that is always warm by the second sip, and the tiny oath that keeps your shoes clever. You might imagine that somewhere a hound declines to bark because it knows your name is correct and that the river is pleased by your balance. You might picture the iron link and feel its weight in your palm. More idea than metal, more promise than burden. We can go on like this, describing what the 9th bridge says to the 8th when no travelers pass, or listing the exact varieties of quiet kept in the hall's cupboard, labeled by season, or cataloging the proper distance between a question and its answer as measured by a polite grain of dust in a winter window. We can rehearse the warmth of the second sip and the way the map turns to handkerchief right when your eyelashes notice it is time. We can count names one more time, set them to dry on the cool edge of thought, and see which ones fog when you breathe. We can, but the road has already curled itself under the blanket of dark. The ledger has closed without snapping, and the bowl of keys has grown very still, as if keys too dream about doors that open themselves and let the night come in to set the chairs straight and tuck the house softly into its frame.